much longer. And so it's very difficult to say, to put one figure on it, but that, we have that average so far. But of course, that's in the context of us being very early on in this whole pandemic.
Just to say, a message came in because we had a very angry message about the idea that somebody's father in their 80s wouldn't get a ventilator, whereas Boris Johnson would. Just to pick up on that, someone steps in to say decisions are no longer made by clinical doctors on an individual basis. The decisions about who gets a ventilator are now officially referred to a newly established unit called Command and Control. If it sounds militaristic, then it is. Centralised decision making. Day 10 is critical in assessing a patient who's failed to improve. A message just in. What do you make of that?
Well, I'd like to reassure the public that our normal decision-making processes that we use on a daily basis have not changed. And so we are not changing the way we practice. We're taking every individual patient on their own merit. And just because you might be older does not mean you will not get admitted to intensive care. If what we can offer in intensive care will have more benefit to that patient than risk, then we will admit the patient. And as I would like to reassure the public and those who are listening to this, that we haven't changed what we do. Doctors are still responsible for the decision-making processes.
There you go. Thank you very much, Dr. Alison Pittard, Dean of the Faculty of Intensive Care Medicine, giving us an insight there from the Prime Minister's perspective, from the doctor's perspective, from all of our perspectives, and what's been going on. Thank you for your time and your insight. Chris got in touch with us this morning to give his take on intensive care. Chris, I believe you had a massive blood clot and ended up in intensive care at QMC Nottingham, is that right?
That is correct. Yes.
What was the experience of intensive care like?
It was pretty. You're very scared. When you go to that floor, you realize it's not a joke. I find it very good. This is just my personal opinion, but I find it very difficult to believe that you can get moved to intensive care floor for a precaution. When you get there, it is truly harrowing. I had multiple blood clots in my body. I'd had previous blood clots that were dealt with, in hospital, but not in intensive care. But on one occasion, I collapsed and I managed to smash my face against something. I had multiple blood clots in my body, and I was taken in intensive care. And obviously, you're completely frightened. At the time, I was the only person that was conscious on that floor, and at that time, I was the only person not getting fed by a tube. When they brought the meal trays up, I was the only person that they only brought one up at that time because I was the only person that could eat. There were people attached to machines. Obviously it was a terrible experience, but the staff were unbelievable. They really cared about, everything, and they really looked after you. It's hard to say it was a terrible experience because the staff took so good care of you. So it's kind of a bittersweet kind of thing. You obviously wouldn't want to be there ever again, but if you are there, the staff were just incredible. It was not a good time. And when you get out, you're not able to bounce back on your feet. It takes weeks before you can even, contemplate really going back to normal life. That's what I would say.
Yeah.
But the staff was absolutely incredible. And to this day, I thank them. My face is completely normal. Half of my face was hanging off when I smashed it. To this day, I'm completely normal now. But, when you go to that floor, you're in big trouble.
Chris in Nottingham, with his experience of the intensive care, you've been getting in touch with yours throughout the morning. 85058 if you wish to share yours. Chris, good to hear that you're on the other side of that, firmly on the other side of that. Of course, with experiencing something completely different. I think what was striking about what Ian Duncan-Smith was saying earlier, as former leader of the Conservative Party, an old friend of Boris Johnson, as well as giving his personal take on what was going on there, is that actually, where he said he thinks Downing Street's even been taken by surprise by this, because the virus moves so fast and somebody's deterioration can be extremely quick. And I think that's something I'm going back to when thinking about this. And if you like, the communication from the very top about this is, daily now we have these press conferences about how we're all going to be handling this moving forward, the lockdown, have to think about that. But at the same time, there's just something, incredibly weird and surreal and sort of, I don't know, just very, very odd that the Prime Minister has this and is now in intensive care. It just seems, while incredibly worrying, incredibly sad, all those human emotions, there's also kind of a message being drummed home by that in and of itself. And that's what some of you are also getting in touch to say. 85058. A message from Andy, who's listening in Romsey, who says, hello, when Nadine Dorries, the health minister, went down with COVID a month or so ago, she said she'd been in touch with a large number of colleagues, including Boris Johnson. At the time, it was stated there were no plans to test the Prime Minister. I thought this was amazing at the time, and unfortunately, I think some of these characters think that they are invincible. This just shows that none of us are, and we should all take sensible precautions. It's also interesting that Matt Hancock got it, and the CMOs also had symptoms, and all this is happening when they were telling us every day to socially isolate. And now with Michael Gove having to isolate, this could get very scary, says Andy. I've been asking for your reactions, and you can keep them coming in on that number, or give us a call on 08285 909 693. As of today, the majority of coronavirus cases are in the richest countries in the world, in places with large economies and well-developed healthcare systems. But that's unlikely to continue. In Africa, for instance, infection rates are rising rapidly across the continent, doubling since last week. And this morning, the African Centre for Disease Control reported 10,075 cases on the continent and 487 deaths. The true number is certainly going to be far higher than that, given the lack of testing and medical facilities. While the philanthropist and Microsoft founder Bill Gates has warned 10 million could die in Africa before the end of the pandemic. Let's talk now to Kate Dooley, the Regional Director for West Africa at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us. It seems it's approximated 18 months before there's a vaccine. What is the worst case scenario for Africa and coronavirus between now and late 2021?
Well, I mean, it's certainly a rather grim outlook at the moment. As you said, their case numbers are rising very rapidly, and that's in a context of very, very limited testing. So the true picture is certainly much worse already. I mean, worst case, there's a lot of different modelling that's being done. You've quoted there the Bill Gates number. I mean, the absolute worst case is certainly tens or hundreds of millions of cases right across Africa. But worse, I think the worst case is actually that we see a rise in the mortality rates, deaths of other diseases. That Africa already bears a large amount of the global disease burden and has a very high number of preventable deaths from maternal and child mortality, malaria, these types of things. So it's not just the coronavirus that's actually going to promote a sort of worst case scenario for Africa, actually, but a whole range of things that the health systems are not really equipped to deal with.
How will it work then, the coordinating of supporting a continent like Africa from the developed world, while the developed world is fighting this?
This is one of the most complex challenges I think we have right now. And, I worked in Sierra Leone during the Ebola outbreak, for example, working with the Tony Blair Institute in the president's office there. And, the whole world was watching and coordination was still difficult. And it did come together. It came together under the banner of governments who themselves obviously knew their country and their people and how best to deploy responses in that context. Right now, the world is distracted by their own crises, naturally. There is a very urgent need to address this coordination gap. Mr. Blair, a range of other leaders have called upon the G20, for example, to stand up and provide that leadership. The WHO, an obvious convening point. There are multiple fronts on which coordination is needed. So the very pressing thing is to address the disruptions in supply chains for essential supplies, including PPE, the protective equipment needed for healthcare workers in particular, essential supplies like oxygen, and so forth, and the equipment that they need to provide more isolation space. These are, in some of these very poorest African countries, they have very limited assets within the health system already. And that's not even to mention the sort of social and economic impact that this crisis is having as countries seek to institute social distancing and impose restrictions on people's physical distance and movement, which is having a really extraordinary economic impact as well, which will also need a coordinated support.
It's difficult, of course, to think about, I suppose, beyond your own at the moment, and that's where I suppose the aid commitments that have been made are important, and also the goals beyond what we normally do, sorry, beyond this time are important to remember. Does that work then fall on ministers for international development? How will that work be being done right now? And if Britain wants to still play that role?
I think that that's absolutely true that, Secretary of State, International Development, similar sort of positions in other governments around the world are all looking at how best they can assist Africa and a range of other developed countries and how they feed into coordinating mechanisms. The complexity here means that what we're looking at is, for example, there are either hard or de facto export bans in place, for example, for PPE in a range of places. Ministers of International Development obviously need to cooperate with their colleagues around their cabinet to address some of the specific blockages that are going to constrain the essential equipment and the coordination effort required. So in some cases, there will be a number of different sources of political leadership needed to tackle this, and potentially quite significant financial resources that need to be mobilised and directed to Africa. So the UN's called for $2.5 trillion of support to developing countries globally, for example. So I think it will have to go beyond ministers of international development.
Well, it's very interesting to get your take on this. I suppose that the biggest concern will also be social distancing. How do you get that message across a continent like Africa, where a lot of people will not have communication devices to even get the message?
No, that's right. It's hugely challenging. And, on one hand, Africa has the benefit of having seen this crisis unfold across Asia, Europe, and the United States, for example. So they were quick to institute, travel bans, to quarantine people coming off planes from overseas. So in that sense, had that